Tonight we begin a journey through the hidden chapters of history that your textbooks never dare to tell you. What if I told you that some of the most powerful men who ever lived, conquerors who shaped civilizations, emperors who built monuments that still stand today, carried secrets so profound that entire empires worked to erase them? We're uncovering the truth about 30 kings whose love stories were written in whispers and buried in shame. These aren't just rumors or gossip. These are documented relationships that historians have spent centuries trying to downplay or ignore completely. And we're starting with two names you definitely know, but whose real stories will absolutely blow your mind. Before we dive into these incredible untold stories together, I'd love it if you could show some love by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a thumbs up, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring tonight. I'm really curious. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? And let me know if you're a night owl like me, or maybe you're on the other side of the world starting your day with some hidden history. Now, let's dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's uncover these ancient secrets that have been hidden for far too long. Alexander the Great and Hephaestion. Our first stop takes us back over 2,000 years to ancient Macedonia, where a young prince was about to become the most feared conqueror in human history. But behind Alexander the Great's legendary military campaigns was a love story so intense that it would define not just his personal life, but the very fate of his empire. It's 356 BC, and in the royal court of Macedonia, two boys are growing up together. One is Alexander, son of King Philip, destined for greatness. The other is Hephaestion, a nobleman's son who would become Alexander's closest companion. But here's what they don't teach you in school. These two weren't just best friends or military allies, including the historian Plutarch. Describe a relationship so intimate and exclusive that it scandalized even the relatively open-minded Greeks. Alexander and Hephaestion were inseparable from childhood. They studied together under Aristotle, trained together as warriors. And when Alexander began his conquest of the known world, Hephaestion was always by his side, but as what the Greeks called his philos, his beloved. Ancient writers describe how Alexander would share his tent with Hephaestion, how they performed rituals together at the tomb of Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary Greek lovers, symbolically declaring their own relationship. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they visited Troy, Alexander laid a wreath at Achilles' tomb while Hephaestion honored Patroclus. They were publicly comparing themselves to history's most famous same-sex couple. The message was clear to anyone who understood Greek culture. Somehow this detail gets conveniently left out of most history books. The depth of their relationship becomes even more apparent when we look at what happened when Hephaestion died. Suddenly, in 324 BC, Alexander didn't just mourn. He completely lost his mind with grief. He ordered the execution of Hephaestion's doctor. He had the manes and tails cut from every horse and mule in the army as a sign of mourning. He spent a fortune building a massive funeral pyre that could be seen for miles. Ancient historians say Alexander threw himself on Hephaestion's body and refused to eat or drink for days. But here's the detail that really tells you everything you need to know about their relationship. Alexander consulted the oracle at Siwa, asking if he could worship Hephaestion as a god. When that was denied, he settled for having him worshipped as a divine hero. Think about that for a moment. The man who conquered most of the known world was so devastated by the loss of his companion that he wanted to literally make him a god. Emperor Hadrian and Antinous. Let's jump forward about 300 years to Rome, where another emperor was about to shock the ancient world with his own forbidden love. Emperor Hadrian is remembered today for building that famous wall across northern Britain. But his most passionate relationship wasn't with any of his wives. It was with a beautiful young man from Egypt named Antinous. Hadrian met Antinous around 123 AD, when the boy was probably just a teenager. What started as a typical Roman mentor-student relationship became something much deeper and more scandalous. Unlike Alexander and Hephaestion, who grew up together as equals, Hadrian was a middle-aged emperor falling deeply in love with someone young enough to be his son, and he didn't care who knew it. Antinous traveled everywhere with Hadrian, appearing in official court ceremonies and state functions. Ancient coins from the period show Antinous' face alongside Hadrian's, an unprecedented honor for someone with no official title or royal blood. The emperor commissioned hundreds of statues of his young lover, more than any other private individual in Roman history. We're talking about a level of public devotion that would have been shocking even by Roman standards. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn that reveals just how deep their connection really was. In 130 AD, while traveling through Egypt, Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile River. The official story was that it was an accident, but many historians believe it was either suicide or some kind of ritual sacrifice. Hadrian's reaction was immediate and extreme. He declared Antinous a god, founded an entire city in his honor called Antinopolis, and established a religious cult that would survive for centuries. Think about the power and audacity of that decision. Hadrian literally created a new religion centered around his dead lover. He ordered temples built across the empire, where people would worship Antinous as a deity. Ancient sources tell us that Hadrian wept openly at official functions and refused to remove his mourning clothes for months. This wasn't just grief. This was a man whose entire world had collapsed. What makes both of these stories so powerful is how they reveal the incredible lengths these rulers went to honor relationships that their societies officially couldn't recognize. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India, yet he risked political instability by showing such extreme favoritism to one man. Hadrian controlled the most powerful military machine in human history, yet he used that power to immortalize a forbidden love. But here's what's really fascinating. Both Alexander and Hadrian were married to women for political reasons. Both fathered children or adopted heirs. Both maintained a public appearance of traditional masculine rulers. Yet their deepest emotional connections, their most profound loves were with men. And the historical evidence is overwhelming if you know where to look. The tragic irony is that both relationships ended with devastating loss that ultimately weakened these great rulers. Alexander died less than a year after Hephaestion. Many believe from grief and a destructive lifestyle he adopted after losing his companion. Though he lived longer, never recovered from Antinous' death, and spent his final years obsessed with preserving his lover's memory. These weren't just powerful men having affairs. These were love stories so intense they shaped the course of empires. Yet for centuries, historians have downplayed these relationships, calling them close friendships or mentorships. The evidence has always been there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to acknowledge what ancient people knew all along. But Alexander and Hadrian were just the beginning. As we move through history, we'll discover that medieval Europe held even darker secrets, where Christian kings had to be far more careful about their forbidden desires. Coming up next, we're traveling to the age of crusades and holy wars, where two of the most famous medieval rulers, one a legendary warrior king, the other a monarch who literally rewrote the Bible, both harbored secrets that would have destroyed their reigns if discovered. The story of Richard the Lionheart and King James might just be the most shocking revelation yet. Richard the Lionheart and King James I. Welcome to the age of holy wars and divine kings, where the cross and the crown created a deadly combination for anyone harboring forbidden desires. We're stepping into medieval Europe, a time when being discovered in the wrong bed, it meant eternal damnation. Even in this world of religious terror, two of the most powerful monarchs in history couldn't resist the pull of forbidden love. And the first one might completely change how you think about the Crusades. Richard the Lionheart. Just hearing that name probably brings up images of a heroic Christian warrior, the noble king who left England to fight the infidels in the Holy Land. Hollywood loves this guy. But here's what they don't tell you in the movies. Richard spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. He was far more interested in his campaigns abroad, and specifically in a certain French king who was supposed to be his enemy. Picture this scene from 1187, both destined to be kings, meeting at the court of Henry II. The future king of England is 29. Philip Augustus, heir to the French throne. By every political calculation, these two should hate each other. England and France have been enemies for generations. Something extraordinary happened. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Richard and Philip became so close that they ate from the same dish and slept in the same bed. Well, maybe that was just normal medieval friendship. Let me give you some context. Medieval chronicles were written by monks and church officials who were very careful about their language. When they bothered to mention that two men were sharing a bed, especially two kings, that was their polite way of saying something much more intimate was happening. Gerald of Wales, a contemporary historian, wrote that Philip and Richard showed such great affection towards each other that the Lord King of England was struck with great admiration. But here's the really telling detail. When Richard's father saw how close his son had become with the French prince, he became extremely fearful and tried to separate them. Henry II was worried about a political alliance, sure, but his reaction suggests he recognized something deeper and more dangerous. The relationship between Richard and Philip becomes even more fascinating when you look at what happened during the Third Crusade. These two men, who had been inseparable, were now supposed to work together to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin. But instead of focusing on their holy mission, they spent most of their time in increasingly bitter personal conflicts. Historical accounts describe jealous rages, public arguments that shocked their own advisors, and reconciliations that were far too emotional for mere political allies. Here's where it gets really interesting. Philip suddenly abandoned the crusade in 1191, claiming illness. But many historians believe he left because he couldn't handle watching Richard's growing obsession with military glory and possibly other relationships. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to completely lose interest in returning home to his wife, Queen Berengaria of Navarre. And speaking of Berengaria, let's talk about one of the most telling pieces of evidence about Richard's true nature. He married her in 1191 for political reasons. They had no children, and she spent most of their marriage living separately from him. Medieval queens had one job above all others. The fact that Richard showed so little interest in this crucial duty was scandalous enough that church officials repeatedly pressured him about it. But the most damning evidence comes from Richard's own actions. In 1195, a hermit named Fulk of Neuilly publicly accused Richard of having 3 daughters that he needed to get rid of: pride, greed, and lust. But when Richard asked what he should do with them, his response was telling. He gave pride to the Knights Templar, greed to the Cistercian monks, and lust to his barons. Medieval audiences would have understood this as a veiled reference to his sexual relationships with men, particularly those in his inner circle. Let's jump forward about 400 years to a completely different kind of scandal. If Richard's story is about passionate, destructive love, then King James I of England gives us something even more complex. A married king who openly flaunted his male lovers in front of his court and somehow managed to keep his throne. James I is famous for commissioning the King James Bible, the version that millions of Americans still read today. The man who gave us the most influential English translation of Christianity's holy book was living in direct violation of its teachings about same-sex relationships, and he didn't seem to care who knew it. James had not one but several well-documented relationships with handsome young men. Famous was with George Villiers, who James elevated from a minor nobleman to the Duke of Buckingham, making him one of the most powerful men in England. And James was not subtle about it. Contemporary accounts describe how James would fondle Villiers in public, call him his sweet child and wife, and shower him with gifts worth millions in today's money. The Venetian ambassador Antonio Foscarini wrote detailed reports back to Venice describing James' extraordinary affection for Villiers and noting that the king caresses him publicly and in private. When a Venetian diplomat is shocked by public displays of affection, you know it's pretty extreme. But here's what makes James' story so fascinating. Unlike Richard, who tried to maintain some level of discretion, James seemed to revel in shocking people. He once wrote a letter to Villiers saying, "I naturally so love your person, as I cannot be happy without you." He called himself your dear dad and husband. These weren't private notes that historians discovered centuries later. These were official correspondence that went through royal channels. The English court was absolutely scandalized. A contemporary writer described how courtiers were disgusted by James' behavior, writing that the king would tumble and kiss Villiers in front of foreign ambassadors. But here's the crazy part. Nobody could do anything about it. James was king by divine right, and as long as he produced heirs with his wife and of Denmark, his personal life was technically untouchable. And he did produce heirs, including the future Charles I. But court observers noted that James showed far more emotional investment in his relationships than he ever did with his wife. And of Denmark reportedly complained bitterly about being ignored in favor of the king's male favorites. There was Robert Carr, who James elevated to the Earl of Somerset. James met Carr when the young man was just a page, and their relationship became so intense that other courtiers started plotting against Carr out of jealousy. When Carr eventually fell from favor, partly due to a murder scandal, James was so devastated that courtiers described him as inconsolable for months. What's really remarkable about both Richard and James is how their forbidden relationships affected their effectiveness as rulers. Richard's obsession with his crusades and his complex relationship with Philip Augustus meant he neglected England so thoroughly that his brother John was able to seize power. James' favoritism toward his male companions created massive political instability, with nobles constantly plotting against whichever young man currently held the king's affections. Yet both men maintained their power precisely because they were kings. Richard could abandon his kingdom for years because his reputation as a warrior was so legendary that people forgave his absence. James could openly flout moral conventions because he successfully played the role of the divinely appointed monarch who was answerable only to God. These stories reveal something profound about medieval and early modern Europe. There was often a strange double standard when it came to powerful men and forbidden relationships. What would have been a death sentence for a common person could be overlooked or at least tolerated in a king, but only if he was careful about maintaining certain appearances. The tragedy in both cases is how these relationships ultimately isolated the kings from their own people. Richard died in 1199 from an infected wound far from England with no clear heir because he'd never bothered to secure his succession. James I managed to die peacefully in his bed, but his reign was marked by constant political turmoil, largely caused by his refusal to hide his personal preferences. What strikes me most about these stories is how they show us that even in the most repressive periods of European history, human desire found a way to express itself. These weren't weak or confused men. They were kings who commanded armies and shaped nations. They risked everything for love. But as we move deeper into history, we'll discover that some rulers found more sophisticated ways to navigate these dangerous waters. We're entering the Renaissance, where Italian princes and French kings turned forbidden desire into an art form, creating elaborate court systems that allow for relationships that would have been impossible in medieval times. The stories of Lorenzo de' Medici and Henri III will show us how power, wealth, and cultural sophistication could create spaces for love that officially didn't exist. Lorenzo de' Medici and Henri III. The Renaissance changed everything. Europe was obsessed with beauty, art, and a classical world where same-sex relationships weren't just tolerated, but this cultural revolution created a fascinating paradox. While the Catholic Church's power remained absolute, wealthy princes and kings found incredibly creative ways to live double lives. And nobody mastered this dangerous game better than two men who turned forbidden desire into high art. Let's start in Florence, the beating heart of the Renaissance, when the most powerful family in Italy was about to produce one of history's most sophisticated lovers. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, wasn't just a ruler, a philosopher, and a patron of the arts, who practically invented the concept of the Renaissance prince. But beneath all that cultural refinement was a man whose deepest passions lay in directions that could have destroyed everything he'd built. Here's what makes Lorenzo's story so captivating. He didn't just have relationships with men. In 15th century Italy, while the Inquisition was burning people for far less, Lorenzo was composing love sonnets to beautiful young men and sharing them at dinner parties with cardinals and bishops. The audacity is absolutely breathtaking. One of his most famous poems, written around 1470, describes his love for a young man named Tommaso. Your eyes so bright and clear pierce through my heart like arrows of gold. But here's the genius part. Lorenzo wrote these poems in the style of classical Greek and Roman verse, essentially hiding his contemporary relationships behind the acceptable veneer of scholarly appreciation for ancient culture. He was basically saying, I'm not writing gay poetry. I'm just really into classical literature. Lorenzo's most documented relationship was with Girolamo Benivieni, a Florentine philosopher and poet who lived in the Medici palace for years. Contemporary sources describe how the two men were inseparable, sharing not just living quarters, but intellectual pursuits and what court observers delicately called intimate philosophical discussions. Angelo Poliziano, one of the greatest humanist scholars of the time, wrote extensively about their relationship in terms that leave little doubt about its nature. But here's where Lorenzo's story gets really interesting. He managed to maintain this lifestyle while being married to Clarice Orsini and producing 4 children. The key was the Renaissance concept of different types of love. Following classical models, Lorenzo and his circle distinguished between matrimonial love, which was about family and politics, and spiritual love, which was about intellectual and emotional connection. Guess which category his relationships with men fell into? Lorenzo's court became famous throughout Europe for its tolerance and sophistication. Young men from noble families would come to Florence specifically to join what was essentially a refined intellectual version of a gay community. They studied philosophy, created art, and formed relationships that would have been impossible anywhere else in Europe. Lorenzo didn't just protect himself. He created an entire cultural environment where forbidden love could flourish under protection of classical scholarship and artistic patronage. The evidence is everywhere if you know how to read it. Lorenzo commissioned countless artworks featuring beautiful young men in mythological settings. David, Ganymede, Adonis. His personal library contained more Greek texts about same-sex relationships than anywhere else in Europe. He funded scholars who specialized in translating classical works that the church usually banned. He was essentially using his wealth and power to create a Renaissance gay scene right under the Pope's nose. Let's travel north to France, where another Renaissance ruler was taking a completely different approach to the same challenges. If Lorenzo was subtle and sophisticated, Henri III of France was dramatic, flamboyant, and absolutely shameless about his preferences. And somehow he got away with it for nearly 15 years. Henri III became king in 1574, and from the very beginning his court was unlike anything France had ever seen. He surrounded himself with young, beautiful noblemen called the Mignons, the darlings, and treated them like a combination of advisors, courtiers, and lovers. These weren't just favorites or close friends. Contemporary sources describe relationships so intimate and exclusive that foreign ambassadors wrote shocked reports back to their home countries. Pierre de Elistoyle, a contemporary chronicler, described Henry's Mignons in detail. They wore their hair long and curled, dressed in silk and velvet, perfumed themselves like women, and shared the king's bed openly. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Henri loves men more than women and cannot hide his passion. These weren't rumors or gossip. These were official diplomatic reports. Henry's most famous relationship was with de Joyeuse, whom he elevated to duke and showered with gifts worth millions in today's currency. When Joyeuse got married, for political reasons, Henry threw a wedding celebration that lasted 15 days and cost so much money that it nearly bankrupted the royal treasury. But here's the really telling detail. Henri was so emotionally distraught about the marriage that courtiers describe him as inconsolable and acting like a jealous lover. The court records from Henry's reign are absolutely fascinating because they show how he essentially institutionalized his relationships with men. He created new court positions specifically for his favorites, gave them apartments in the royal palaces, and established elaborate ceremonies where they would dress him, accompany him to mass, and sleep in his chambers. He turned forbidden relationships into official court protocol. But Henry's story reveals something crucial about how these Renaissance rulers navigated religious and political pressure. Unlike medieval kings who had to hide their relationships, Henry survived by being so openly theatrical about everything that people couldn't quite tell what was real versus performance. He would dress in elaborate costumes, wear makeup and jewelry, and host masquerade balls where gender roles were deliberately confused. In a strange way, his flamboyance provided cover for his relationships. Contemporary accounts describe how Henry would appear at court functions wearing pearl earrings, silk gowns, and elaborate headdresses. The Spanish ambassador wrote that the king behaves more like a woman than a man. But here's the genius part. By making everything so theatrical and excessive, Henry made it impossible for his enemies to pin down exactly what they were accusing him of. Was he just really into fashion? Was this some kind of political statement? The ambiguity protected him. Both Lorenzo and Henri show us how the Renaissance created new possibilities for powerful men to live authentically while maintaining their positions. But they also reveal the enormous energy that went into managing these double lives. Lorenzo spent a fortune funding classical scholarship partly to create intellectual cover for his lifestyle. Henry turned his entire court into an elaborate performance that exhausted everyone around him. What's really remarkable is how both men used cultural innovation to create space for forbidden relationships. Lorenzo essentially invented Renaissance humanism partly as a way to make same-sex relationships intellectually respectable. Henry pioneered new forms of court entertainment and ceremony that normalized intimate relationships between men. They weren't just living secret lives. They were shaping their entire cultures to accommodate their authentic selves. But the psychological cost was enormous. Lorenzo's poetry is filled with references to secrecy, danger, and the pain of loving someone you can't publicly acknowledge. Henry's court became so theatrical and artificial that observers described it as exhausting and surreal. Both men created elaborate systems that allowed them to love freely, but those systems required constant maintenance and performance. The tragedy is that both died relatively young, Lorenzo at 43, Henri at 38, and their deaths marked the end of the tolerant, sophisticated worlds they created. Lorenzo's Florence gradually became more conservative under his successors. Henry's court was disbanded immediately after his assassination, and his minions were scattered or killed. These Renaissance stories show us something profound about the relationship between power, culture, and personal freedom. Both Lorenzo and Henri discovered that you could use wealth, artistic patronage, and cultural innovation to create spaces for authentic living, even in repressive societies. But those spaces were fragile and required enormous resources to maintain. As we continue our journey through history, we'll see how different cultures handled these same challenges in completely different ways. We're venturing into the Ottoman Empire, where the most powerful sultans in Islamic history created their own systems for forbidden relationships. Systems so sophisticated and secretive that they remained hidden from Western historians for centuries. The stories of Mehmed the Conqueror and Murad IV show us how empire and desire intersected in ways that would shock even our Renaissance princes. Mehmed the Conqueror and Murad IV. Now we're crossing into a completely different world, one where the rules about power, religion, and forbidden desire operated by entirely different logic. The Ottoman Empire at its height controlled 3 continents and ruled over 50 million people, making it the most powerful force on earth. But hidden within the magnificent palaces of Constantinople was a system so sophisticated for managing royal relationships that it remained secret from Western historians until very recently. What we're about to discover will completely change how you think about Islamic culture and imperial power. Picture Constantinople in 1453. The city that had been the heart of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years is about to fall to a 21-year-old sultan who would reshape the entire world. Known to history as a conqueror, was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely obsessed with both classical culture and beautiful young men. And unlike our European kings, he didn't have to hide it. Here's what's fascinating about Ottoman culture. Europe was burning people for same-sex relationships. The Islamic world had a completely different approach. Persian and Turkish poetry celebrated male beauty. Intellectual relationships between men and boys were considered noble, and the Ottoman court system actually institutionalized these relationships in ways that would have shocked medieval Europeans. Mehmed too grew up reading Persian poetry that openly celebrated love between men. His personal library, which still exists, contains hundreds of manuscripts about classical male beauty and philosophical relationships. But more importantly, he inherited a court system where sultans traditionally had both wives for political alliances and male companions for emotional and intellectual connection. The most documented of Mehmed's relationships was with a young Greek noble named Radu Frumos, Radu the Beautiful, who'd been brought to the Ottoman court as a hostage. Byzantine chroniclers describe how Mehmed became so infatuated with Radu that he learned Greek poetry specifically to write verses for him. When Radu was eventually sent back to Wallachia as a ruler friendly to the Ottomans, Mehmed reportedly wept openly in court. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Ottoman court records written in Ottoman Turkish describe these relationships using specific terminology that showed they were recognized and acceptable. Mehmed's companions weren't hidden lovers. They were mashiks, officially recognized favorites who had specific roles in court hierarchy. They received titles, salaries, and apartments in the palace. It was part of the governmental structure. The Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkikondyles, who lived the conquest of Constantinople, wrote detailed accounts of Mehmed's court that include descriptions of his relationships with young men. What's remarkable is that Chalkikondyles, a Christian writing for a Christian audience, doesn't present these relationships as scandalous, just as foreign and different from Byzantine customs. Mehmed's relationship with Radu wasn't just personal. It became a crucial part of his political strategy. By placing a lover on the throne of Wallachia, Mehmed created a buffer state that remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire for decades. This wasn't just about desire. It was about using emotional connections to build political alliances in ways that European kingdoms couldn't imagine. But the most telling evidence about Mehmed's relationships comes from his behavior after the conquest of Constantinople. While his army was expecting weeks of looting and celebration, Mehmed immediately began converting the city into a cultural center that would rival Renaissance Florence. He imported Greek scholars, built libraries, and commissioned artworks that celebrated classical male beauty. He was essentially creating his ideal environment for the kind of sophisticated relationships he valued. Ottoman court poetry from Mehmed's reign is filled with references to the Sultan's appreciation for beautiful young men. Poets like Ahmed Pasha wrote elaborate verses describing the Sultan's favorites, and these poems were read aloud at court functions. In one famous poem, Ahmed Pasha describes how the Sultan's heart burns like a moth around a flame of beauty, clearly referring to Mem's infatuation with a particular young courtier. Let's jump forward about 150 years to another Ottoman sultan who took these traditions in a completely different direction. Murad IV is remembered by historians as one of the most brutal rulers in Ottoman history, a man who personally executed thousands of people and banned everything from coffee to tobacco. But this terrifying sultan had a secret that reveals a completely different side of his personality. Murad IV ruled from 1623 to 1640 during one of the most chaotic periods in Ottoman history. The empire was facing rebellions, military defeats, and economic crisis. Murad's response was to impose absolute control through violence and terror. He would personally patrol the streets of Constantinople at night, executing anyone he found violating his decrees. Contemporary accounts describe him as paranoid, unpredictable, and absolutely ruthless. But French diplomatic records from the period tell a completely different story about Murad's private life. The French ambassador Jean-Baptiste Tavernier wrote detailed reports describing the Sultan's intimate relationship with a young Janissary officer named Coach Mustafa. According to Tavernier, Murad would spend hours in private with Coach Mustafa discussing poetry and philosophy, in complete contrast to his public persona as a tyrant. What makes Murad's story so fascinating is how he uses absolute power to create a private world where he could be completely different from his public image. Ottoman court records describe elaborate private ceremonies where Murad would gather with a small group of young male courtiers for poetry readings and intellectual discussions. These gatherings were so secretive that most of his own ministers didn't know they existed. The Venetian merchant and explorer Evliya Chelebi, who spent time at Murad's court, wrote in his travel memoirs about the Sultan's tender side that was visible only to a select few. Chelebi describes how Murad would transform completely in the presence of his favorites, becoming gentle, intellectual, and almost scholarly, the exact opposite of the terrifying ruler everyone else knew. But here's what's really remarkable about both Mehmed and Murad. They represent two completely different ways of handling the same basic human needs within the Ottoman system. Mehmed was open, cultured, and used his relationships as part of his public political strategy. Murad was secretive, paranoid, and created a hidden world where he could express vulnerability and tenderness that would have been impossible. The key difference between Ottoman rulers and their European counterparts was a cultural framework they inherited. While Christian Europe was increasingly repressive about same-sex relationships, the Ottoman Empire maintained Persian and Central Asian traditions that recognized multiple forms of love and companionship. This doesn't mean it was completely tolerant. There were still boundaries and expectations, but it created space for relationships that would have been impossible in London or Paris. What's really striking is how both sultans used their absolute power to protect and institutionalize relationships that remained intensely personal. Mehmed created an entire cultural environment that celebrated the kind of beauty and intellect he valued. Murad carved out private spaces where he could escape the brutal requirements of his public role. The tragic irony is that both men ultimately died isolated and alone despite having the power to command anything they wanted. Mehmed died at 50, with rumors that his grief over losing several young favorites had made him careless about his own safety. Murad died at 28, possibly from alcohol poisoning, having become increasingly paranoid and unable to trust anyone, even his closest companions. These Ottoman stories reveal something profound about how cultural context shapes personal possibility. While European kings had to choose between authenticity and power, Ottoman sultans inherited systems that allowed for both, but only within very specific parameters. The sophistication of their solutions shows just how much energy and creativity goes into navigating forbidden desire when you have unlimited resources. But as we return to Europe, we'll discover that some of the most familiar names in English history were fighting in their own unique ways. We're diving into stories that will completely change how you think about English royal history. Tales of kings whose forbidden relationships literally shaped the modern world, where love and political disaster became so intertwined that they're impossible to separate. Edward II and William III. Back to the land where Shakespeare would one day write about kings, except the real stories were far more dramatic than anything he ever put on stage. English royal history is filled with tales of political intrigue and romantic scandal. But two kings in particular managed to turn forbidden desire into national catastrophe. Their stories reveal how dangerous it could be when personal passion collided with political reality in medieval and early modern England. Edward II came to the throne in 1307, with everything going for him, physically imposing, and heir to one of the most successful kings in English history. His father, Edward I, had conquered Wales and nearly conquered Scotland, leaving behind a powerful kingdom and a clear path to military glory. But Edward II had absolutely no interest in following that path. Instead, he was completely obsessed with a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, and this obsession would ultimately destroy both of them. Here's what makes Edward's story so compelling. This wasn't a hidden relationship or a secret affair. Edward made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, one of the most powerful titles in England, within months of becoming king. He gave him lands worth millions in today's currency and appointed him regent when Edward had to leave the country. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Edward would publicly embrace Gaveston and shower him with gifts that outraged the English nobility. The Chronicle of Lenacost, written by contemporary monks, describes Edward's behavior toward Gaveston in language that leaves no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The king, upon his return from France, kept not company with his wife, but with Piers Gaveston. Another chronicler, the author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, wrote that Edward loved him above all mortals, and that their relationship caused scandal throughout the kingdom. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The English barons weren't just upset about the king having a male lover. They were furious about how this relationship was disrupting the entire political system. Gaveston wasn't just Edward's favorite. He was essentially running the country, while Edward ignored his royal duties. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their capitals that the King of England seemed more interested in his companion than in governing his kingdom. The situation became so extreme that in 1308, just 1 year into Edward's reign, the barons forced the king to exile Gaveston to Ireland. But Edward was so desperate to get his lover back that he negotiated with the Pope, bribed English nobles, and essentially traded away royal prerogatives to secure Gaveston's return. When Gaveston came back to England in 1309, Edward immediately restored all his titles and lands, proving that nothing had changed. Contemporary accounts describe the reunion between Edward and Gaveston in terms that shocked even medieval observers. The Chronicle of Lenacost reports that Edward received him with great joy, as if recovering a beloved brother. But the word they actually used was delectus, which in medieval Latin carried romantic connotations that would have been clear to educated readers. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston ultimately led to civil war. In 1311, the barons again forced Gaveston into exile, and when he returned without permission in 1312, they captured and executed him. Edward's reaction was immediate and devastating. He declared war on his own nobles, plunging England into years of conflict that would eventually cost him his throne and his life. But here's the really tragic part. Edward never learned from the disaster. After Gaveston's death, he immediately formed another intense relationship, this time with Hugh Despenser. And just like with Gaveston, Edward gave Despenser enormous power and wealth while ignoring the growing opposition from his nobles and his wife. The relationship with Despenser was even more politically destructive than the one with Gaveston. Contemporary sources describe how Edward would spend entire days with Despenser, neglecting state business and foreign policy. The Brute Chronicle reports that Edward loved Hugh Despenser more than any earthly man, and that this love brought sorrow to all England. By 1326, Edward's Queen Isabella had fled to France and was raising an army to overthrow her own husband. When she invaded England, Edward's support collapsed almost immediately, partly because the English nobility was so tired of his favoritism toward male companions. Edward and Despenser fled together, but they were captured within months. Despenser was executed in one of the most brutal ways possible, and Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son. Edward II died in Berkeley Castle in 1327, probably murdered on Isabella's orders. The symbolic irony of his death, supposedly killed with a red-hot poker inserted into the body, shows how his enemies wanted to punish him specifically for his sexual relationships. His forbidden love had literally cost him his kingdom and his life. Let's jump forward about 3.5 centuries to a completely different kind of English king. William III came to the throne in 1689, not through inheritance but through invitation. The English Parliament had invited him to overthrow the Catholic James II and restore Protestant rule. But William brought with him secrets that would have scandalized the very people who had welcomed him as their liberator. William III was married to Mary II, and together they were known as the joint monarchs who secured England's Protestant future and established the foundation for modern parliamentary democracy. But while Mary focused on domestic affairs, William spent most of his time with a small circle of handsome young Dutch nobles who had followed him to England. The most documented of William's relationships was with Arnold Joost van Keppel, whom William made the Earl of Albemarle, despite the fact that Keppel was the son of a minor Dutch official with no claim to English nobility. Contemporary court observers noted that William would spend hours in private consultation with Keppel, supposedly discussing military strategy, but the nature of their relationship was obvious to anyone who observed them together. The Duchess of Marlborough, and one of the most powerful women at court, wrote in her memoirs about William's extraordinary fondness for Keppel and noted that the king seemed more concerned with his companion's welfare than with affairs of state. The Duchess was particularly scandalized by how William would publicly show affection toward Keppel in ways that she considered inappropriate. But here's what makes William's story so different from Edward II. William was incredibly careful to maintain the appearance of proper royal behavior while pursuing his personal relationships. Unlike Edward, who flaunted his favorites and ignored political consequences, William created a system where his relationships with men operated parallel to, rather than in conflict with, his royal. William's other well-documented relationship was with Hans Willem Bentinck, who became the Earl of Portland. Bentinck had been William's closest companion since childhood, and when William became King of England, Bentinck essentially became his private secretary, confidant, and what we might today call his chief of staff. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence shows that foreign ambassadors understood they needed to work through Bentinck to reach the king. The fascinating thing about William's relationships is how he managed to maintain them while being married to Mary, who was not only his wife, but also his co-ruler. Court records suggest that Mary was fully aware of William's relationships with men and had essentially negotiated a private arrangement that allowed both of them to maintain their public roles while living separate personal lives. But this system came with its own costs. William became increasingly isolated and paranoid, trusting only his Dutch companions and alienating the English nobility who had brought him to power. His marriage to Mary was purely political. They had no children, and contemporary observers noted that they seemed more like business partners and spouses. The contrast between Edward II and William III is absolutely fascinating, because it shows two completely different strategies for managing forbidden relationships as king. Edward chose passion over politics and lost everything. William chose politics over passion and managed to keep his throne, becoming increasingly cold and isolated. What's really striking is how both men's relationships affected their effectiveness as rulers, just in opposite ways. Edward's emotional intensity and public favoritism created political chaos that ultimately destroyed his reign. William's careful discretion and emotional distance allowed him to maintain power, but made him unpopular and ineffective at building the kind of personal connections that effective monarchy required. Both stories reveal the impossible situation faced by English kings who couldn't or wouldn't conform to traditional expectations about royal masculinity. The system demanded public performance of heterosexual marriage and masculine authority, but it offered no legitimate space for authentic emotional connections that fell outside those boundaries. The tragedy in both cases is how these brilliant, complex men were forced to choose between personal authenticity and political survival. Edward chose authenticity and was destroyed. William chose survival and lived a life of careful performance and emotional restraint. But England wasn't the only kingdom where royal secrets shaped national destiny. Just across the channel, the French court was developing its own elaborate systems for managing forbidden desire, creating some of the most sophisticated and scandalous royal relationships in European history. What we're about to discover about French kings will make even these English stories seem tame by comparison. Louis XIII and Philippe I, France had always been different. While other European kingdoms struggled with the contradictions between royal duty and personal desire, the French court turned forbidden relationships into an art form. At Versailles and the palaces that came before it, elaborate systems of etiquette, ceremony, and carefully managed scandal allowed for relationships that would have been impossible anywhere else. But even by French standards, two royal brothers managed to shock an entire kingdom with their approach to love and power. Let's start with one of the most psychologically fascinating kings. Louis XIII ruled for 33 years from 1610 to 1643, but spent most of that time letting Cardinal Richelieu actually run the country, while he focused on what really interested him, and elaborate court ceremonies that allowed him to be close to them. Louis XIII was famous for being extremely shy, deeply religious, and completely uninterested in his wife, Anne of Austria. They were married for 23 years before producing their first child. the future Louis XIV, and court observers noted that the king seemed to find his marital duties deeply unpleasant. But what Louis lacked in enthusiasm for his wife, he made up for in his passionate friendships with handsome young noblemen. The most documented of Louis's relationships was with Henri Coiffure de Ruse, Marquis de Cinq-Mars, a stunningly beautiful young man who joined the court when he was just 18. Cardinal Richelieu himself introduced Cinq-Mars to the king, apparently hoping to use the young man's influence to manage Louis's increasingly erratic behavior. What Richelieu didn't expect was how completely Louis would become obsessed. Contemporary court memoirs describe the relationship between Louis and Cinq-Mars in terms that leave little doubt about its nature. The Duc de Saint-Simon wrote that the king could not bear to be separated from Cinq-Mars for even a few hours, and that Louis would become agitated and melancholy whenever his favorite was absent from court. Louis gave Cinq-Mars apartments directly adjacent to the royal chambers and established daily routines that ensured they would spend most of their time together. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Louis's relationship with Cinq-Mars wasn't just personal. It became a crucial element in French politics. Cinq-Mars used his influence over the king to build his own power base, eventually plotting against Cardinal Richelieu himself. When Richelieu discovered the plot in 1642, he faced an impossible choice: his own position by destroying the king's beloved favorite, or allow a conspiracy to succeed that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Richelieu chose to destroy Cinq-Mars, presenting Louis with evidence of treason that was impossible to ignore. The king's reaction reveals everything about the depth of his feelings. According to court records, Louis wept openly when he signed Cinq-Mars' death warrant, then locked himself in his chambers for days, refusing to see anyone. The execution of his favorite essentially broke Louis's spirit. He died less than a year later, many believe, from grief and the stress of losing the person he loved most. But Louis XIII's story also reveals something fascinating about how French court culture accommodated relationships that couldn't be officially recognized. Louis created elaborate hunting parties, military reviews, and court ceremonies that were essentially designed to provide opportunities for intimate conversation and private time with his favorites. The entire court understood what was happening, but the formal structure of royal protocol provided cover for relationships that existed in plain sight. Let's talk about Louis's nephew, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, who took this French tradition of royal scandal to levels that shocked even sophisticated courtiers of Versailles. Was a younger brother of Louis XIV, and he lived his entire life as an openly gay man in the most public court in Europe. He not only survived, but thrived. Philippe I is one of the most extraordinary figures in European royal history because he completely rejected every convention about royal masculinity. From childhood, he preferred women's clothing, makeup, and jewelry. He surrounded himself with male lovers, participated in elaborate cross-dressing parties, and conducted his relationships with men so openly that foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about them to their home government. The most famous of Philippe's relationships was with Philippe de Lorraine, known as the Chevalier de Lorraine, a relationship so scandalous that it caused diplomatic incidents with other European courts. The Chevalier was not just Philippe's lover, but essentially his unofficial spouse, living in the royal palace, participating in state functions, and wielding enormous influence over French policy. Contemporary court memoirs by Elizabeth Charlotte, Philippe's second wife, provide incredible detail about this relationship. She wrote that Philippe loved the Chevalier more than any woman he had ever known, and that their relationship was the talk of every court in Europe. What makes her account so valuable is that Elizabeth Charlotte wasn't writing gossip. She was documenting her own lived experience as the wife of a man whose primary emotional relationship was with another man. But here's what makes Philippe's story so remarkable. Despite living completely outside conventional gender norms, he was one of the most successful military commanders of his generation. Philippe won crucial battles for France, including the Battle of Cassel in 1677, where he personally led cavalry charges while wearing elaborate makeup and jewelry. Enemy commanders reportedly didn't know whether to be terrified or confused by this flamboyant prince, who fought like a demon while looking like he was headed to a costume ball. The French court system that allowed Philippe to live so openly was incredibly sophisticated. Louis XIV, despite being one of the most absolute monarchs in European history, essentially created protected spaces for his brother's relationships. Philippe had his own court at the Château de Saint-Cloud, where he could live exactly as he pleased. But this wasn't just royal indulgence. It was political calculation. By allowing Philippe to be openly different, Louis XIV solved several problems at once. He satisfied his brother's need for authenticity, prevented the kind of political conspiracies that had destroyed relationships between royal brothers and other kingdoms, and actually used Philippe's unconventional lifestyle as a diplomatic tool. Foreign courts never quite knew how to handle Philippe, giving France psychological advantages in negotiations. Court records from the period show how this system worked in practice. Philippe would appear at formal Versailles functions dressed in women's clothing, accompanied by the Chevalier de Lorraine, and everyone would simply pretend this was normal court protocol. Foreign ambassadors wrote confused reports back to their capitals, describing a French prince who defied every convention about royal behavior, while remaining one of the most powerful and effective members of the royal family. But the psychological cost of this system was enormous for both Louis XIII and Philippe I. Louis's relationship with Cinq-Mars ultimately destroyed his emotional stability and may have hastened his death. Philippe, despite his apparent freedom, lived under constant pressure to prove his loyalty to his brother, and the kingdom, knowing that his unconventional lifestyle made him vulnerable to political enemies. What's really fascinating is how both men used different strategies to navigate the same basic challenge: how to live authentically while maintaining royal power. Louis tried to hide his relationships within traditional court structures, and was ultimately destroyed when those relationships created political conflict. Philippe openly defied conventions, but did so within a system that his brother carefully controlled to prevent political consequences. Both stories reveal something profound about the relationship between authenticity and power in early modern Europe. The French court system was sophisticated enough to accommodate unconventional relationships, but only within very specific parameters that preserved royal authority and political stability. The tragedy is that both men paid enormous emotional cost for their strategies. Louis lived in constant anxiety about discovery and political consequences. Philippe lived with the knowledge that his freedom existed only at his brother's pleasure and could be withdrawn at any time. But France wasn't the only kingdom developing sophisticated approaches to these challenges. Across the Rhine, German princes were creating their own unique solutions to the problem of forbidden royal desire. What we're about to discover about Frederick the Great and Ludwig II will show us how German culture handled these relationships in ways that were both more intellectual and more tragic than anything we've seen so far. As we reach the end of our journey through these 30 royal secrets, what strikes me most is how universal and timeless these stories really are. From Alexander the Great in ancient Macedonia to the troubled kings of modern Europe, we've seen the same fundamental human needs playing out across different cultures, religions, and political systems. Every one of these kings, whether they ruled through absolute power or constitutional constraint, whether they lived in tolerant Renaissance courts or oppressive medieval societies, faced the same basic challenge: how to be authentic while meeting the impossible expectations placed on royal authority. Some found creative solutions that allowed them to live and love authentically within the constraints of their time. Others were destroyed by the contradictions between personal desire and public duty. But all of them remind us that behind every crown, every ceremony, and every display of royal power was a human being struggling with the same needs for connection, understanding, and authentic love that drive all of us. These stories have been hidden for centuries, buried in diplomatic archives, disguised in court protocols, and coded in artistic, but they're finally emerging as historians gain access to new sources and develop new frameworks for understanding the complex relationship between power and personal authenticity. What we discovered is that the history of forbidden royal love is really the history of human creativity in the face of impossible constraints. These 30 kings found ways to build meaningful relationships despite religious persecution, political opposition, and social rejection. Their strategies, from Alexander's public mourning rituals to Henry III's theatrical performances, from Frederick the Great's philosophical salons to Ludwig's artistic scandals, show us the incredible lengths people will go to live authentically. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through some of history's most closely guarded secrets. We've traveled from ancient empires to modern nations, explored the rise and fall of dynasties, and uncovered love stories that shaped the course of European civilization. These weren't just kings. They were human beings whose courage to love authentically despite impossible odds ultimately made them more powerful and memorable than any crown or conquest ever could. I hope these stories have given you a new perspective on both royal history and the universal human experience of seeking authentic connection that often demands conformity. The next time you visit a palace, see a royal portrait, or read about historical kings, remember that behind all that pageantry and power were real people facing the same fundamental challenges we all face in living authentic, meaningful lives. Keep exploring, keep questioning the official stories, and keep looking for human truth behind historical legends. There are so many more incredible secrets waiting to be discovered, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, sweet dreams, and remember, love always finds a way, even in the most impossible circumstances.